This is a really special panel session, and we had the idea of this panel specifically when we realized that it was the one-year anniversary next week of the tragedy of the balcony collapse right here in downtown Berkeley, in the middle of the festival footprint, in fact. And so we reached out to Culture Ireland and wanted to bring some Irish writers, and specifically to have a session that commemorated the tragedy and the survivors. There are some, fortunately, who are surviving and doing pretty well. So to open the session, we have the Irish Vice Consul, Colm Hatchell. He'll speak for just a couple minutes, and then Mayor Tom Bates from Berkeley will speak, and then Colin will read the names of the Irish students, and then there'll be just a moment of silence, and then we'll start into the panel. So, Colm, welcome. Yeah, here, you want to just take... Oh, you want to go behind the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, go behind. I'll just get out of the way. There we go. Cell phones off, by the way.
Good afternoon, everybody. Almost 1 year ago, on June 16th, 2015, a fourth floor balcony in an apartment complex very close to here in Berkeley suddenly collapsed. On that balcony were 13 young Irish people, most of whom had recently arrived from Ireland for a summer in the Bay Area, all of whom were looking forward to a summer of work, of cultural exploration, of fun and friendship. 6, Olivia Burke, Ashley Donoghue, Owen Culligan, Lorcan Miller, Nikolai Schuster, and Emer Walsh were killed. 7 others were seriously injured and had their lives changed forever. This appalling tragedy had enormous resonance in Ireland, which is why the assistance of the city of Berkeley and of community throughout the Bay Area meant so much. The motto of Berkeley is Fiat Lux, let there be light. The first responders of the Berkeley Police and Fire Departments, staff in hospitals and medical centres, city government officials led by Mayor Tom Bates, they were that light. And their unstinting efforts made this terrible event more bearable. The Irish government, the Irish consulate in San Francisco, and most importantly, the young people and the families involved will never forget those efforts and remain deeply grateful. In that shared pain and loss, deep bonds of friendship were forged. And we know this friendship joins us together for happier times, like today, and on into the future. Gurv Mágiv, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is such a terrible tragedy, but it's actually brought the bonds together between ourselves and the Irish people. Out of this tragedy, when it was so horrible what occurred, but I just want you to know that we in Berkeley have taken steps to make sure that never happens again. We passed an ordinance that requires the reinspection of all of the balconies that are currently exist in Berkeley. We are going through and making sure they are actually safe. You can drive, as you walk around, you see people you'll see scaffolding up around with where their actually work is underway. And then my wife, Lonnie Hancock, the state senator, introduced legislation which is going to make it a state law that we're going to have much stricter standards for the balconies in the future. So it's really sad. Let's have that moment of silence for the students who lost their lives. Thank you so much, and let's have a wonderful panel. We're so thrilled that they're here. So once again, something bad, something good happens. So welcome, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Bates, and thank you, Colm Hatchell from the consulate. I'm Ethan Nosowsky. I'm the editorial director of Grey Wolf Press, and I'm your moderator today. And I'll mostly try to sit to the side of these extraordinary authors that we have as our guests today. A couple of bits of admin before we get started. If you haven't already silenced your cell phone, please do that. Afterwards, after the event today, these authors will be signing books at the Green Apple Books booth, which is, I think, just out the doors on Alston and to your left. And I think that's it. I think the format today is basically we're just going to try to talk and read a tiny bit and tell some stories. And I will leave some time at the end. There are a lot of you here, and I'll bet a lot of you have your own questions. I'm sure many of you have read these books already. And I'll leave, a good amount of time for questions at the end, and we'll have those sort of lining up down the center aisle here. So you can come up to a microphone if you have a question. So, well, like I said, it's just a terrific privilege to be here with these three writers today. I've been reading Colm's books for years, like a lot of you have, and in the last couple of years, really more recently becoming familiar with Sara Baume's extraordinary debut, Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither, and Belinda McKeon's Tender. That was her second novel, but the first one for me. And I'll tell you a little bit about who our guests are here. Starting on the far left is Colm Tóibín. He's the author of 8 novels, including Brooklyn and Nora Webster, and 2 collections of stories. His play, The Testament of Mary, was nominated for a Tony Award for Best Play in 2013. His most recent book is on Elizabeth Bishop, the poet Elizabeth Bishop, and he teaches at Columbia currently. Next to Colm is Sara Baume. Her debut novel, Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither, those are the seasons for those of you who don't know this book already, was longlisted for the Guardian First Book Award in 2015 and shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award. Last autumn, she was a participant in the International Writing Program run by the University of Iowa, and she received a literary fellowship from the Lannan Foundation, the Angels at the Lannan Foundation, amazing place, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She lives on the southwest coast of Ireland. Belinda McKeon is the author of who's next to me, is the author of 2 novels, Solace, which won the Faber Prize and was named Irish Book of the Year in 2011, and Tender, published earlier this year and just shortlisted for the Encore Award. Her fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Granta, the Paris Review, the New York Times, and elsewhere. She is also a playwright, and she lives in Brooklyn and teaches at Rutgers University. So this is just the very terms of this panel are super interesting in a way, and we were having some funny emails back and forth about things like the supposed Green Hills of Ireland and what this means. And of course, to talk about a tradition in any country is to often talk about multiple traditions. Part of the goal of this panel was very much to explore how place shapes your life as a writer. And so in a way to start, I wanted to talk a little bit, and of course, as all of these writers know, and as probably most of you out there know, really any writer starts as a reader. And so I wanted to kind of start talking about the context of books in the world in which you grew up, sort of before you became a writer. And I was listening to a little memoir piece that Colm wrote. Is it A Guest at the Table? A Guest at the Table, which unfortunately doesn't seem to be available here quite yet. But I was listening to the audiobook, which is really lovely. And there's an incredible scene where you discover some sort of forbidden books, I guess, up high on a shelf. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that and what you were your parents were teachers, I think, too. So I'm just curious about what the world of books was in your house.
Yeah.
Are we on?
Hello?
Here, buddy, take this one.
Yeah, I furtively published a memoir. I thought if I published it online, that nobody would read it.
Sorry, I did my research.
I just believe in print. My parents' bedroom, there were 2 wardrobes, and the wardrobe nearest the window had books hidden on top of it. And there were 3 books, and one of them, I presumed for some years that John Updike was an Irish writer, because the other 2 were by Irish writers. There were John Updike's Couples, Edna O'Brien's The Country Girls, and John McGahern's The Dark. Now, the significance, I suppose I'm talking about the mid-1960s, was that The Dark and The Country Girls had both been banned by the Irish Censorship Board. And because they included references to sex. John Updike's book, as you know, included many references to sex. And these books were sort of passed around. Is this echoing, or is there anything I can... Is that okay? Oh, right. I think that's okay now. Yeah, I think we're okay now. Right, okay. Is the wire long enough? Can I turn this off? Turn this off. So, I mean, right. That in 1929, I mean, really, as soon as the first government was fully in place, one of the early things they did was begin a system of censorship of books. How it happened would be that if anyone at all read a book, they would underline the offending passages and send them to the censorship board, who would in general ban the book. And it became a badge of honour for an Irish writer, but a strange badge of honour in that, your books could not be on sale in any bookshop in your own country. And it's certainly, by the early 1960s, it became a matter of great embarrassment to the government itself, who were almost afraid to change the law, but certainly to Irish people. And it did do a great deal of damage. I mean, it sounds funny in retrospect when you read out the list of who was banned. But it gave a sense, in a way, of the sort of power the government felt that writers had, that so many books had to be banned, and they put such care into banning them, and the church oversaw this. And also the fact that Belinda and myself were friends with John McGahern, whose book The Dark was banned. It certainly didn't amuse him to find that a book that he had put so much work into every sentence of, that he had chiseled as a sort of literary book, to be treated as a dirty book in this way and hidden on over wardrobes in houses, was not something that amused him. And in the case of Edna O'Brien, she went to London, where she mainly still lives, and her book was even burned in her village. But just that sense for me, that shadow was there. I mean, I poured through the books to find the dirty bits, and I have to say they're very tame in retrospect. But just the idea that books at that time, in the mid 1960s, were still things that were considered dangerous.
Belinda, maybe you could. What about for you? I mean, obviously we're of a slightly younger generation, and we've gone. You went past the banning of books, but what was the sort of the place of literature really in your house as you became a writer yourself?
Well, I grew up on a farm, and a lot of the time reading was an escape from that for me, because if you were reading, then it seemed like scholarly work. And you couldn't get landed with a bucket to take out to an animal. So it was a really convenient excuse. But there weren't very many books in my house growing up, but there was a house next door which was empty a lot of the time because the owner was away and had a very exotic life. And I would go up there to water the plants, but actually to read what I could find on the shelves. It was a two-story house, and there was a whole floor upstairs which was just floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. I mean, I can't pretend that it was terribly erudite reading. I remember poring through one of Jilly Cooper's books. Do people know who Jilly Cooper is? Oh God, okay, I have to explain Jilly Cooper. So these were sex books about horse riders, basically. Well, it was erotic fiction about people who liked horses. Not for sex, I should say, but horses and sex they liked. And the covers also, you always had whips and jodhpurs and things like that, and titles like Riders. So those are my literary memories from probably the age of 9 or 10. But then another neighbour of ours gave me John McGahern's novel Amongst Women. It came out in 1990, and it must have I suppose, been a big book that year. I would have been then and I don't know, 11 or 12, and she gave me this book for my birthday. And I thought, well, you know, that looks, I remember it had, the cover of the first edition was a black cover with a tricolour draped across it. And my association of, and this will tell you something, my association of the tricolour at that time was of the funerals of people who had connections to the IRA, had their tricolours draped across the coffin. And I thought, what is this? Why am I getting this for my birthday? I'm not going to be interested in this novel. And I read it, and it was just a transformative experience to encounter, you know, not just story. I mean, I think I had been reading for story up to that point, but this was an encounter with the force of language itself, and with atmosphere and with mood. And it was also a world that seemed familiar to me in many ways. You know, Amongst Women is a family novel. It's a novel about daughters growing up on a farm in a part of Ireland not very far from where I lived, actually, which was also a sort of an astonishing thing to think that fiction could be written about the place that you live in, as opposed to about sexy English people who liked horses. That was a turning point for me, and McGahern's work became really important to me from then on, and remained so. I also came upon, I mean, similarly, my discovery of the dead was accidental. It was in I don't know what sort of anthology this must have been, but occasionally there were these book clubs that would send things out, and it was in an anthology of short stories, not Irish short stories, but short stories. And I discovered it completely innocently. I mean, just finding myself reading a story about a party, essentially, that I couldn't put down. And years later realized, oh, that was the dead. I was 10 reading the dead, and or maybe not 10, but you know, that age, 10 or 11. And again, the encounter with language, something beyond the idea of a plot.
And Sara, you grew up also in rural Ireland, like Belinda, right?
Yeah, and I have a Jilly Cooper story as well. No, we had a shelf. No, I had my dad was never a reader. My mum was definitely a reader, and we had, again, the shelves. When you were talking about the hidden shelf, we had the very bottom shelf of the bookshelves had like, what I realise now was like your Jilly Coopers and your Mills and Boon. I think John Grisham was on that shelf as well. And then, because it was like the least visible one, and then higher up, there was, you know, the books that my mother wanted people to know that she read, you know? So from quite young, I guess I had this idea of what was literature and what was something else. But I didn't, again, like Belinda, when I was first beginning to read, you know, adult books as opposed to teen fiction or whatever. I would have been a teenager, and, you know, you just want to escape from your home place then. You're disgruntled about everything in your life. So I wasn't reading Irish fiction. It wasn't enough about escapism for me. I loved Anglo-Indian literature, and I read a lot of American, like Hemingway and Steinbeck, and it was only later on when I was trying to learn how to write, I think probably after I did my master's, or during the master's, that I started reading Irish writers, because I was trying to learn, and it's easier to learn from something that draws from your frame of reference. So I remember reading Dubliners then, short story collections particularly, because that's what I was trying to write, and McGahern, Claire Keegan, because much later generation. I remember reading The Empty Family.
It's funny this, that you came into these things. I was interested in too what Belinda said about, you know, in a way wanting permission to read about your own place. That's a valid thing to write about. And of course, I think of, you know, maybe going because of Dubliners as that was the book that made the local, you know, said the local can be universal. You know, that this incredible detailed world, you know, portrayed in Dubliners that seems, you know, provincial in its way, actually is, you know, completely universal. But it also touches on, you know, this idea, you know, this panel was supposed to be talking about the tradition of Irish literature in a way, and I think, you know, if I were on a panel that had to say that about American literature, I would just die, because, you know, if you go back to the, you know, Whitman and, you know, these incredible different streams, you know, of like Whitman and Dickinson or something, and I guess I could make something up to try to tie them together. But you did say, I was reading an interview with you, Sara, where you really kind of claimed the rural tradition. I think you said that I'd definitely rather be associated with the rural tradition in an interview somewhere. So what did you mean by that, and how did you come into it, I guess, both either as a reader or a writer?
Well, it's where I live. I'm the complete opposite to I am the Green Hills in that where I live, it's completely rural. It's a farmhouse kind of in the middle of nowhere, and there's cows out the window as opposed to all the neighbours are bachelor farmers, so it's very stereotypical in that way. But I don't really know what I meant by that, because it's such a it's such a difficult tradition, I suppose, to write about in a contemporary sense. And I've also always been insecure because I'm not from a farming family. My dad is English, so I'm kind of, though I grew up in rural Ireland and though I live there again now, I suppose just because I love it so much and don't know what else to write about. As in, it's what I know, but it's
and yet you've written essentially a road novel where your character is getting out of the place, right? I mean, they kind of escape a bit.
No, he remains in rural Ireland.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Get out of the place.
But Colm, you obviously grew up in a small town, and you were sort of taking issue with this, with the green hills. That's not my Ireland in a way. So, but were those when you became a writer, and actually you started as reading poetry, it seems like mostly. But when you started as a writer, was there a sense that you were writing into a tradition, or were there, obviously you were looking at John Updike, thinking he was Irish too.
I think there's something about Ireland and writing that it's different, say, than England or France or even America, which is that Ireland became a nation before it became a state. And so there are about 50 or 60 years where the nation is being formed and the nation is being essentially imagined. And while there are politicians involved making speeches, the main thing that's happening is cultural. In other words, I'm talking about a period from, say, the 1850s onwards, but especially becoming very intense in the early years of the 20th century, when figures such as W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory and John Millington Synge and others began to imagine Ireland in their own likeness, or in a likeness, that Yeats's evocation of the Irish landscape, of Lady Gregory's translations from ancient Irish literature, of John Millington Synge's attempt to forge a new sort of way of writing drama about the west of Ireland in a very sort of innovative way, that they were both, all of them, attempting to be modern and in a way evoke the ancient, and that had extraordinary power on political life and in the end on daily life in Ireland. As the country, as the state came into being, it came into being from the imagination, which is in a way one of the reasons why the censorship was done. It wasn't merely that the Catholic Church didn't like sex, which they didn't like sex, but that the state realized that this business of writers is very, very dangerous. That, for example, in the 1920s, the literature of disillusion began. Figures such as Frank O'Connor and Sean O'Faolain, who had been involved in the revolutionary period, began to write short stories which made clear that the revolution wasn't such a heroic business after all. There were stories like Guests of the Nation showed its cruel side and showed the marks that the violence left on people. So that literature in Ireland has always had a sort of strange and special place, also partly because it's very easy to get paper and a pen. And it's much easier to do that than get a cello or get canvas to work on. So we didn't have a Rembrandt and we didn't have Beethoven, but we did in the end have W.B. Yeats and James Joyce. But that all of the writing, including Yeats's writing, especially after the foundation of the state, in the way poems such as Leda and the Swan or poems about great houses became almost like dissident writing, almost about ways of establishing a reality away from the political reality or the daily reality or what was in the newspapers. And the Ulysses itself, for example, the novel, seems to me more and more a political novel, a way of intervening politically in a debate by placing a Jewish character at the very center of a novel, allowing him to have a sort of glittering mind, a way of noticing, and to move around a city all day thinking about everything, including sex, including politics. And then in the last chapter, by letting a woman speak without being interrupted, which was something in 1922 that probably mattered more than anything else in the country.
It's interesting. I think thank you. There is actually sort of some interesting political context to several novels. I think of Belinda's novel too, in a way, as still, this recent novel, Tender, which is about essentially an erotic relationship between a young woman in university and her best friend, who it turns out is gay. And this was, the context of this, I guess, actually is sort of interesting, as I'm thinking that it's set, is it shortly before or after even just the fact of being a homosexual was criminalized, and then of course many years before, and then your book was published just as the Marriage Equality Act was kind of passed, and I think that there's an interesting political context there too, and I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, but that kind of political context for me always sort of bleeds into a book accidentally. It comes with the territory of thinking about, both of my books have been about Irish people. They've been Tender is set almost entirely in Ireland. Solace was set entirely in Ireland. And for me, and I think for a lot of Irish writers, writing about Irish people brings with it the business of writing about Irish society and about Irish politics often. And yes, it's true, Tender is set in the late 90s. And so James, the young man you mentioned, he would be part of the first generation who came of age after the decriminalization of homosexuality, which happened in 1993. So in 1998, he's 20. I guess that context is there. And I suppose it was something that I had to think about a little bit while writing the book, because I wanted to evoke the sense of what the 90s were like for a character like him, and for Catherine, the central character. And so I drew on my own memories of hearing radio debates in 1993 when the decriminalization was going through. And I remember very clearly being a teenager at home listening to those debates and listening to the things that were being said. And you mentioned that the novel came out in the UK and Ireland last May, which was just a week before the equal marriage referendum. And that was a time when I never thought that 20 years later, debates which seemed almost identical would be happening on the radio, and that young people growing up in Ireland would have to listen, young LGBT people growing up in Ireland would have to listen to their identities being dissected and debated and roared about. But that came to be. So I think if you write about a place and you write about people in a time, you'll inevitably end up writing about a political canvas, but probably not doing it deliberately. But maybe Ireland is the kind of country where it pushes its way in anyway. I mean, a lot of the novels that are coming out now this year, I noticed we were just talking about Mike McCormick's new novel before the panel started. And I mean, contemporary Irish fiction is about the problems that contemporary Ireland has wrought for its people. Those problems, they come to the surface of the work. But that's as a consequence of thinking deeply about what it's like to be a person in a country like Ireland.
I wonder if that's a good moment to read a little bit. You were it's interesting. I feel like Ireland's one of these countries where there's this incredible push-pull in the country. Both writers sort of go and exile themselves in order to write about the place. But you had a passage that was somewhat explicitly about this. I think maybe you want to. I'm going to try to give a few minutes for each author here to read a bit, and so you can get a sense of the song.
So this is a scene set at a party in Dublin, which my two characters really gate crash. It's a party for a successful older painter, and they sort of talk their way into the party. And it's 1998, as I mentioned, and another political context that sort of pushes its way into the novel is that this happens to be the eve of the Good Friday Agreement, which is so in the north at the time of this party the talks are happening, but this is in Dublin. Many drinks later, people began to sing. Was this a new thing in Dublin now, Catherine wondered, that every time a group of people were together in a house, they had to start singing? Unlike the evening in James's flat, though, there were no guitars and no joints going around. Instead, people were taking it in turns to stand by the fireplace and sing mostly ballads of the mournful Irish variety. Bula Vogue, a woman was wailing her way through now, which was a song that Catherine had not heard since being forced to learn it in primary school. This was a tradition at the Doonan parties, Nate informed Catherine and James, coming up to them as they stood, catching up on each other's evenings. He got up to sing his song soon afterwards, and as soon as he started, with no preamble, just a look, a tender and it seemed intensely private look at Ed, something in the room went still. He had not even finished with the first line. It was not a line that Catherine recognised, though she could tell it was another of the old Irish ballads, and it was as though the entire room of people, 30 or 40 of them standing and sitting, had caught their breath and then drawn it in more deeply, a deep, slow breath of sadness and gratitude. Nate's voice was strong and clear, and he was well able to hold a note, but that was not the reason. It was something else, she knew. Behind her, James sighed heavily, and she turned to him. "What is it?" she whispered, tugging at him. "What is this?" "My lagan love," he whispered, his eyes locked on Nate. Amazing. The Lagan, that was in Belfast, where Ed was from and where the talks were, of course, happening tonight. And that was, of course, it. That was why the room had reacted this way. And listening to the lines, "The night is on her hair," he was singing now, and something about love sickness. Catherine felt herself yield to them too, felt herself becoming wistful and emotional and pleasurably, gratifyingly swollen with the momentousness of it all. That while this very song was being sung here in Dublin, history was maybe being made a couple of 100 miles to the north. What a moment this was. The Irish Times woman should write about it and put it in the next day's paper. Although it was too late for the next day's paper now, of course. It was almost 2 a.m. But in Saturday's edition, maybe with a description of the dazzling people who had been at the party, Catherine and James named among them. Across the room, Ed was watching Nate with tears falling, shining on his cheeks. Catherine's arm moved to nudge James, but she found that she could not do this, that she did not want to, she realised in the next moment. She did not want James to see Ed there crying as his lover sang the song that he had learned for him as a surprise, as a gift. "For love is Lord of all," Nate sang, and afterwards they cheered him to the skies.
Great, thank you. So that's a sort of a very, it's Belinda's book is a story basically of a woman from a farming family coming to a city. And I think if Sarah's Spill, Simmer, Falter, Wither is very much rooted in the countryside, obviously where you live and where you're from. And I wonder, in thinking about this question of Irishness, could you imagine your character, Ray, who's never named, you only learn the protagonist's name essentially through indirection, but could he live anywhere else? Do you imagine? Could this story, which is essentially about an outsider, a man who in probably any small town would be familiar, somebody who's a little bit off, who's off to the side and ignored, in a way, a certain kind of figure in any kind of small community. But is there something about him that was very Irish to you, or that you were writing into a certain kind of figure or place, or was it really through the landscape that made it feel Irish?
He was based on a sort of iconic figure in the village where I was living at the time, and which was an old man, and probably older than the character in the book. And he had a little dog, and he'd walk up and down the road with it. And people since have said to me, like, I know this guy. This guy was in my village as well. He was he'd come out every day and he'd walk the dog, and that's the only time you'd see him, kind of thing. And maybe he's an alcoholic or whatever the case may be. But so. I think maybe he's in every village, but someone wrote an interesting piece after the book was published, not a general piece about sort of outsiders and outsider narrators in Irish fiction. And I hadn't really known that I was drawing off a tradition, but when you think of like Beckett's Malloy or Leopold Bloom being an outsider in the sense of being a Jew, like Gulliver and Gulliver's Travels, that perhaps there's something that draws us to these outsiders, but I do think they're everywhere. That they're universal in that way, and that's perhaps where they're fascinating.
You tried writing about places that you don't live. You've said like very much that you can't. I'm just curious about that. Like, I think there's a difference here between certain kinds of fiction that's in a way imagine other worlds and others that kind of open out from a specific place.
Yeah, I don't think I'm a writer. I think I have a crap imagination, which is but I didn't. My background is visual arts, and I was trying to be a sculptor when I when I started doing this. So I don't really approach a book like it's a book. I have a project in my head, and sometimes the material is, fabric or wood or metal, and sometimes the material is words. In this case, it was words, and that makes it sound very spontaneous and romantic. Obviously, it was a bit more of a clinical process than that, but I'm certainly not trying to make any statements or do something political. It's an art project for me.
Yeah, I mean, your prose to me reads very much like it's composed by ear, I guess. That in a way, the rhythms are telling you what happens next. Does that? I mean, this isn't a sort of a plot-driven novel per se, although it's got a certain tension to it.
It's a sentence by sentence basis, and it's more a visual for me, I suppose. I see things, either I see them or I construct them somewhat from things that I've seen, and then I describe them, and that's how I write. I don't really start with language. I start with.
You don't
with
start
image.
with language. Oh.
No, and build language onto it. It's the only way I know how.
So what was the initiating image in this book for you?
I think the old man, as I described, in the village, and how he sort of hobbled up and down and had his dog, and people were slightly suspicious of him, I think, and sort of stayed away from this guy.
But the dog is yours.
The dog was kind of the conduit.
The dog is very much a character in this book, by the way.
Well, the countryside is full of odd-looking little black mangled dogs. So there was his dog, and then there was my dog, and that came about, I suppose, because it was a way of making the voice. So I didn't want the narrator. The entire book is spoken from the man to his dog, and I think speaking to an animal, I suppose, is something different. As in, you're not speaking in your own mind. Speaking to yourself is somewhat incoherent. Speaking to someone else is perhaps dishonest because in how articulate it is. But speaking to something that doesn't understand is both honest and articulate enough to build a voice around. And
maybe you could give us a little flavor of that voice.
This is, you mentioned it was a road novel, so I'll read a little bit from the beginning of the third section when they go on the road. And just, he's talking to his dog, so you are the dog. We are driving, driving, driving over hill slopes and humpback bridges, through loose chippings and potholes wide as children's paddling pools and deep as old people's graves, past lavender hedges, betting shops, sports grounds, past countless closed doors behind which are countless uncaring strangers, their lives going on and on and on relentlessly. We are heading inland, keeping to the back roads as much as possible. You're looking at the rear windscreen where the view is best, or perching on the passenger seat with your nose pressed to the air vents. What do you smell? Fox spray and honeysuckle, pine marten and stinkhorn, 7 different kinds of sap. Riding in the car is like watching a never-ending reel at a wraparound cinema, complete with the surround sound of engine putter, with the pipe scent of petrol fuels, and passing countryside. We are driving, driving, driving. And the wraparound car screen is reeling off monkey puzzle trees and peeling eucalyptus, parish halls and handball alleys. Here's a pair of running shoes tied by the laces and slung over a phone wire high above the road. Here's a steel grain silo at the edge of a farmyard, nose pointed to the moon like a shoddy rocket. Now here's a crucifix set in concrete with a vase full of shriveled stalks in front, a roadside memorial shrine. The plaque's too small to read, but what it means is that somebody died here, on this most seemingly non-treacherous of corners with a cow field either side. What it means is that even the tattered verges are depositories of celebration and devastation in unequal measure. We are driving, driving, driving. And the wraparound car screen is reeling off fields and fields and fields of rape and oats and barley, which have all died now and in death turned to gold. Torn filaments of their gold blows to the ditches, sticks in the prickles, dangles and glitters like premature tinsel. We are driving, driving, driving. And the car is our house now, home. The boot is our attic. The loose chippings are our floorboards. The sunroof is our balcony. The back roads and hinterlands are our ceaselessly surging view.
the world and the picture that you kind of paint there, to use your visual art metaphor, is so vivid and strong, and it's obviously a kind of an incredible tug, this landscape. And I want to kind of come back to this sort of joking point that we were making in our email correspondence with Colm before, last week about being from a town. But I was intrigued that there are sort of two things I want to get at here, which is if there's a rural and an urban tradition in Irish fiction, there's also kind of an exile tradition and people who stay in a way. I think you've got Joyce and Beckett who left, and Flann O'Brien or McGahern who stayed. And I guess to this day, Edna O'Brien's in London, or Anne Enright, I guess, has stayed, right? Anne Enright's sort of been in Ireland, and I had read something in your Bishop book, Colm, which is kind of great. It's about Elizabeth Bishop, but it's also about kind of writerly identity in a way. And at one point, you wrote, "I had escaped Ireland in 1975 with its dull and controlling Catholicism, its political conservatism, its intractable historical problems emerging again in the guise of car bombs, armed struggle, and nationalism." But then that, in a way, sets up just a page later that this was a place you needed to write, that it was a piece of landscape that you'd written that brought you back to Ireland in a little. Could you describe that process a bit for us?
Yeah, I was writing their first novel. It was set in Spain. They were having fun. They were painting. They were getting drunk. They were having sex. And there was a lot of glamour. And I thought I was stuck. I just had nowhere to bring them then. They'd done all that. And then it struck me, well, why don't I bring them home? And then I thought, well, I didn't even think, I wasn't, you're not thinking, you're just trying to, what you're talking about, that idea of trying to find an image. What's home? Where will I bring them if I bring them in Ireland? And of course, then I found the stretch of the coast in County Wexford where we had gone every summer, 10 miles from Enniscorthy, where I'm from. And the minute I brought them there, the minute I used the phrase, the strand instead of the beach, it's not a beach, it's a strand. I don't know why it's called a strand, but it's called a strand. And then describing the erosion that goes on there, then describing the little stream that goes down in a place called Ballyconnegar Lower, that I was in a place that I could find a tone or that the sentences came easier and seemed truer once I was there, that there was a jagged thing not there anymore. I was very surprised by this because of all the things I thought I would do. Writing about the town of Enniscorthy, where I'm from, or this stretch of the coast was not one I ever wanted to do. And but then the next novel I wrote is almost entirely set there. And I have to say, it really surprised the family. I mean, this is an issue which we haven't really raised, but you're writing about very small places, and if people certainly recognize the places. I'm naming the places. It's not as though I'm saying, I'm thinking of a new name for this, but it has to be that place. And then, of course, people begin to feel that they're recognizing the people who live locally. And then you're putting in real names of people. And then you're putting something that your aunt actually said. And then, of course, you're inventing the next bit, which puzzles people even more. And so you're circling and circling this area, almost like a bird looking for something glittering. You're looking for something that's going to work in your book. You use things that are true. You use things that are made up right beside each other, but all the time you're using these contours, the eroding coast, just that stretch going from Ballyconnegar Upper down towards Curracloe in County Wexford, and then the topography of the town of Enniscorthy. But these were things that when I was starting to write, and I was reading Hemingway and I was reading Kafka, I wanted to be locked up somewhere, so I could write about the prison experience. And I was living in Spain, I was living in Barcelona. The idea that this dull Irish light, this scarce light, this, as I say, grim business of the politics and the way, in fact, because I'm gay, the way being gay, the amount of navigation you have to do all the time, that I thought it would never yield anything. And then it was what began to yield most. It was the strangest thing.
Do you find yourself writing differently? Because you sort of divide your time, right, between Ireland and the United States. Do you find yourself writing differently or about different subjects? Do you write essays in one place and fiction in another?
No, it's always just a state of panic. If I don't, if I don't finish this, no one else will. I'm the laziest person who's ever lived. Get up, finish, shut up. No more chocolate today. There's no it's basically just you just make rules about this page is blank, fill it. and try and make what you do as good as you can. But if you started saying, when I'm writing an essay, I'm this, or what I'm doing, just it isn't like that. There's far too much pressure, as far as I'm concerned, for any sort of thinking. Yeah.
It's interesting, that's the thing, the annoying thing about Ireland is this tiny place that's generated so many amazing writers that we all must read, that whereas America is a huge place and we can all escape rather easily. But I think in this issue of, that you were saying that it's kind of tricky to write about these small places. And I wonder, Belinda, you've said that you couldn't write about it really, and you've been in New York for, you said, over a decade now, right?
Yeah, I find Ireland too exciting. When I go back there, and I go back there a lot actually, I'm constantly drawn back there, but I can't live there because I just get so overstimulated, overexcited, and I can't sit down to write because I'm just dying to know what's going on. I have basically FOMO about Ireland, fear of missing out, and I can't concentrate there. I'm not joking. I go sometimes to, and I think of it, I don't think, there's no workspace there. Sometimes I go to an artist's retreat in Monaghan, the Tyrone Guthrie Centre, which is just this extraordinary place. And I might get a little bit of writing done there, but I'll probably be popping out of the room all the time just to listen to people talking and to hear what's going on, and just so nosy, basically. I'm just really, really nosy. And Ireland is a really, nosy-friendly place. It's so gossipy. There's always some turn of phrase. I was saying this I was in Ireland 3 weeks ago. I do go back a lot. And I was in the front room trying to write. I had to give a lecture. I discovered on the morning of what I thought was a reading. It was actually a lecture. So I had to write it. And my brother, Michael, is building a house at home at the moment. And the builder had called into our parents' house to talk to Michael about the house, about the site. And they were having this conversation. And I was just sitting there going, this is gold. The things they're saying, I just want to transcribe everything and use it. I remember at one point the builder said to my brother, "No, that's a very good-looking brick now." And I just, there's just too much, and that's, multiply that by 1 million, and that's an average day in Ireland. And so I just had to get away. And I write about Ireland, but from a distance of 3,000 miles, because when I'm there, I just feel, ADHD, everything. I just can't.
What's funny to me about that, and of course, there's this great sort of, that essentially everybody in Ireland seems to be a storyteller or can be a storyteller in some way. But what's so funny is for all of this talk, all of your characters seem absolutely to be able to not be able to say what they mean.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like in Colm's case, actually, that's almost reinforced stylistically in the restraint you bring. It's not this, kind of overflowing, ornate lyric style. How would you connect some of your style issues to this issue of talk, I guess?
I suppose there is a gender issue here where a lot of the women would talk, but they would never talk about what was on their minds. And a lot of the men were just grumpy. They just say, turn down the television, or that was a good goal. That first goal in that match on Sunday was good. I say, the second goal was good too. And then there's the thing that Belinda writes about, which is the business of going to Dublin from the country. Mary Robinson was elected President of Ireland in 1990, and she was very liberal. So one of the first things she did was she invited gay and lesbian people to her house, to the equivalent of the White House, or as a Nurturance. And the government had a veto on her speeches because she's head of state. And so she decided not to speak, just to be silent, just to pour tea, smile, and welcome people. This was a huge thing. And all the gay groups were really excited about who was going and what people were wearing and what was going to happen. But then someone told me, of course, one person was so out in Dublin, so ready for the world in Dublin, but hadn't told his parents. And he was then discovered the television camera was going to be on him. It was going to be on the 6 o'clock news. And I put this into my novel, The Blackwater Lightship, and someone says to him, well, like, why haven't you told him? He said, well, you see, at home, I'm homosexual, I'm gay, but even the heterosexual ones, they haven't told my parents that they're heterosexual. I mean, they haven't come out as heterosexuals. I mean, we just don't talk about sex, and the number of things then you don't talk about. And then the house could be filled with talk. And then you then try and develop, I suppose, a style from this idea that held within is so much. And the sentences try and enact the sort of restraint and tact, a mixture of restraint and tact that people are engaged in their daily lives, that you find saying too much might actually to give something away, so you hold on to every sentence. Your punctuation becomes your strong point. And then you find that you end up parodying yourself, and you try and write longer sentences, but they don't work. So yes, I suppose that idea of, you talk about storytelling. I hate storytelling, and if anyone told me a story, I'd really go run. And at home, no one ever told any stories much. People were grumpy. And so that, Beckett was a social realist to a large extent. Some of those characters just going along mumbling something odd to themselves. I know that person. I sort of am that person. And and also, people wouldn't tell you if you wanted to know a story. People would be really careful. They'd look at you very suspiciously. And they wouldn't tell you the story if you needed to know it. So a story becomes a sort of thing held in.
This is maybe a good moment for you maybe to read a bit from Nora Webster, which very much evokes, I guess, this world of your youth where people were talking but not talking. But I don't know what passage you had in mind.
I got worried about the book early on, that it was meant to be set in the 1960s, and there was nothing about the 1960s in the book. But it really was, because I remembered it. But I was trying to think, 1960s, people were talking about drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Well, there were no drugs in the town. I mean, there was alcohol, but there were cigarettes, but no one had marijuana or anything. And sex, people, yes, in darkened rooms, married people by consent, I suppose, had sex. And I was trying to think, rock and roll, no, I didn't remember any rock and roll. So then I was trying to think of one thing that did happen. So what happened, really, it did really happen in circa 1967, 68. The three hairdressers in the town got big, cheap packets of hair dye, and every woman in the town got her hair dyed. And you would go to a friend's house, and her mother would come to you'd look at her, she'd gone gold overnight, and it was like autumn. And this is Nora Webster, whose husband is dead about 6 months at this point. On Wednesday morning, Nora went downtown and had her hair done, talking to Bernie and the hairdressers about a new system of dyeing hair she'd read about, wondering if it was time that she did something about the grey. I wouldn't like it blue, she said. I know what you mean, Bernie replied. And if it was too black, then it would look dyed. And I was never blonde. Everyone in the town knows I was never blonde. Is there a good brown, so that it might not look dyed? I could try this one. Bernie showed her a package with a photograph of a woman with curly brown hair that looked natural. Maybe just start off with a small bit, Nora said. No, the instructions say to use the whole thing. I've used it before. It's very popular. You'd be surprised who has it. Oh, well, try it so, Nora said. Once the dye had been applied, Bernie put a nylon net on her head and left her to flick through some magazines. When she saw that she would not be home in time to cook a proper dinner, this is a time when dinner's in the middle of the day, for the boys, she regretted having come here at all and knew that she would have to go soon. She signalled to Bernie, who was now busy with two women who had come in together and appeared to need to consult each other about each clip of the scissors. I'll be right with you, Bernie said. When she came over to remove the net, Bernie told her not to worry or look too closely, as the real change would come only once the dryer and a brush and comb were used. Nora was aware that the two women Bernie had been looking after were studying her closely. Nora wondered if she should not have consulted other women before getting her hair dyed for the first time, but she couldn't think of anyone she could have asked. The more Bernie worked, the more her hair seemed to look like a wig. She knew that the dye would take time to wash out, but in the mirror she could see how pleased Bernie was with her own work. There would be no point in complaining. Is it not a bit young for me, she asked. I think you look great, Bernie replied. The cut is very fashionable at the moment. I've never had a fashionable cut before, she said. When it was finished, she knew that anyone who saw her on the way home would think that she'd lost her mind, or that she was trying to look like a younger woman than someone who was recently widowed. It'll take a few days to get used to, Bernie said, but no one has grey hair anymore. Does the dye not look very unnatural? In a few days it will lose that look and people will think that you've had it all your life. You look very worried, but I promise you that by the weekend you'll be delighted with it. You can't wash it out, can you? No, but it will fade, and I guarantee you that you'll be back in a month for the same again. I've never known anyone to go back to the grey, but maybe the next time we'll think of putting some highlights in. They're all the rage now as well. Highlights? Oh, I don't think so.
Thank you. That's terrific. I think now, actually, we might, I want to leave enough time for people to ask questions. We can always come back if there aren't a lot of questions. But if anybody wants to, maybe, how would you guys like to do it? Will we bring a mic to the center, maybe?
Yeah, I'll take one of the mics and
Okay.
line up in the
Okay, great. If anybody has questions, if people don't have questions, I'll keep asking them. Somebody in the back there?
Hi, my mother-in-law is from Skibbereen in County Cork, and we were just there to celebrate Easter Rising. And I wonder if on this occasion of the 100th year since Easter Rising, you all are reflecting on what it means to be Irish, what it means to kind of tell stories throughout the diaspora. If this is an occasion for any particular reflection, or it's just a point in time and people keep evolving.
Dublin on Easter Sunday this year was very interesting. I mean, the state had a problem. I mean, how do you commemorate a rebellion in which a very small group of people took it on themselves to take over public buildings in the city, thus causing immense destruction and loss of life, without, in fact, encouraging others in the future who may feel the same to go and do the same thing? I mean, we're just getting over a really difficult time in Northern Ireland. And what they did was they used the Irish Army. And the Irish Army mightn't mean much to you, I mean, maybe you haven't heard of it, but I mean, it's not exactly, people don't live in fear, oh, the Irish Army will come, But as the army went through the streets of Dublin in the very few, I mean, they're not very well equipped, but I mean they're very well equipped for what they do, but it's not a huge army. But as they went through to the main streets of the city, people began to spontaneously applaud. And the reason is that the Irish Army has never gone to war since the foundation of the state. That the Irish Army, under the umbrella of the United Nations, does peacekeeping missions. And that we have been to countries like Lebanon, Chad, Bosnia, Congo, and they know that all of the people they were applauding have been very brave under very difficult conditions as they kept peace. But it's about the idea of a state being founded, and people being proud of that state and living in that state, and the army somehow representing that state at its best, at its most exalted. There's just the idea of, under the umbrella of the United Nations, that we might have made a difference in some other countries. They didn't applaud the politicians in the same spirit, I have to say, and I was watching this very carefully, although the president was applauded, again, as a figure of state. But that I suppose what I noticed that day, this is recently, that there is a sense in Ireland of pride about the country, but also a need to complicate the narrative, a need to say the 1916 rebellion was not entirely necessary. There perhaps was a better way of doing it, which would not have involved loss of life. And yes, the people were heroic, and yes, some of them were poets, and yes, the executions were cruel. But that the number of civilian casualties outnumbered, I mean, more than half those killed were civilians. Many children were killed in the rebellion. And so I think there was an effort this time around, 100 years later, to commemorate and to interrogate as much as to celebrate.
Yeah, and I would agree with a lot of what Colm says, and clearly lots of people do. But I think that it's possible, and every Irish writer and Irish artist this year has been asked to take part in a lot of events, and it's always been celebrating the centenary. And thinking, as your question addressed, thinking about what it means to be Irish, I suppose, or what Irish identity means. But I think it's possible to to honour the bravery of those who rose up in 1916, while still recognising that the Ireland that they had in mind, the Ireland that they envisioned in the proclamation and that they wanted to bring about, is very far from having come about. And the line in that proclamation which calls for the children of the nation to be cherished equally is still very far away from being realised. So I think for a lot of us, there was a great hypocrisy in watching a government which at that moment in fact wasn't even a government, because it had been several weeks into the attempt to form a government, which turned into an 80-day squabble between government parties, watching them going through this international parade essentially of pride in themselves, while the people of the nation are wanting in many ways. There's a homelessness crisis in the country, there's a health system crisis in the country, women's rights are far from being as they should be in Ireland. Women are still second-class citizens in many ways. So I think it's a year in which many of us do wonder, well, yes, applaud the bravery of those who rose up, but what is there to celebrate really, and should we toe the line in that way? And I think not.
Sarah, are you feeling it in the countryside there, the centenary? Not your question.
Hi there, I'm from County Kerry. I've been here for about 15 years. It's lovely to see some Irish folk up there. I have two questions. Well, one is, what is your opinion on the necessity of an MFA? There's so much talk here about writers and the necessity of an MFA to become a writer or to be a recognised writer and to have that credential. And of course, for me as a low self-esteem Irish person, it's really compressing me as a writer, because I am a writer, and it's keeping me away from the business of writing, actually. I do have a B.Ed, but we never have enough. As for me, that's in my psyche, it's not enough. And then the other part of my question is, how do you go about creating that voice for the page, or that particular narrator that you're going to use? Is there a particular way that you get into that aspect of your work?
Yeah, well, I have done an MFA, MA, MPhil, we called it at home. But I don't know how. I know they're much more of a thing here. Now they're a thing in Ireland now as well. When I did it, there were only two in the country, in Trinity and UCD, and now there's one in Waterford, there's one in Galway, there's probably one in Kerry before long. So I don't know, I'm kind of conflicted, because I don't really think they're necessary. I did one, but it was another 5 years before I got the book out, and the book was really written in that in a sort of 5-year period where I thought that I'd failed at everything in life, and I had no particular job. I was waitressing, and it was that kind of despair, I think. So it was the experience of life itself that wrote the book. But then maybe it's the foundation that was built up by being forced to do a lot of reading in that time, which I hadn't before. I think they're for you. Some of them aren't. Another part of me thinks, wow, don't diss them, because you might get a job out of one day now as a writer. So I'm kind of conflicted. Maybe they both teach, so maybe you can.
I teach undergrads, actually, but I have an MFA from an American university. I came to the US 11 years ago to do an MFA, and it was in some ways a mixed experience, but I'm really glad I did it, and it was the right thing for me to do at the time. It's a really personal thing, whether an MFA will suit you or not. I think there's a lot of bashing of MFAs, which sort of become fashionable to say that, they're churning out the same kind of, that's absolute nonsense. They're not churning out the same kind of writer. And I think that if you need structure, if you'll benefit from an environment where you'll be surrounded by other people who've decided to dedicate 2 years to thinking about their writing and talking about their writing and writing, then maybe you'll benefit from that. They're really, really expensive though, and that it's a bit of a racket in that way. So if there's funding available, then it is like many other things, by the way.
I didn't do one, and I don't teach in one. I just want to address the issue about voice, about finding. It's really hard, and you get it wrong. And sometimes the person who's writing short stories should be writing drama. The person who's writing a novel should be writing poetry. There's something in your DNA that suggests a form for you, and you may not know it. And I mean, an MFA may help you find it, but you can also find it by just trying, by just working, and by having one friend who will be, and the one friend has to be special because they have to be nice to you at the same time as make clear to you, look, maybe you should do more work. And I started trying to write poetry. And I mean, I really, really had a terrible time, because I couldn't write poetry. And then I tried to write short stories. I couldn't write short stories. And then a novel came to me out of the blue when I was about 26, 27, and I started to work on it. But it took me a long time to find a publisher for it. It was rejected by everybody. And one of the publishers, because my first name would not be gender, people in England wouldn't know whether it was a man or a woman, said, well, if she writes anything else, do let us know, but we don't want to publish this book. And it was so disappointing getting those rejections. And, I think it is possible to work alone, but you can't be entirely alone. You always need a friend or a group. And in a way, perhaps there will come a time when there will be a writing that won't be, a publisher will be able to say, this writer did not go to an MFA program. And everybody would say, oh my God, I've got to read this book because I need to know how somebody like that will write. But there's often also only one thing you need to write, and sometimes you don't know what it is yet. And it's the thing you least want someone to know. And it may be about you, but it may be something you've imagined that you don't want anyone else to know. And then slowly you release it. And that gives you a style.
I think Lonnie Hancock had a question, I think.
Well, I'm really interested in the voice and the writing part. This is a sort of political question based on the question before. To what extent is Irish writing now still informed by what was really a colonial experience between Ireland and England? And then the English-Irish and the Irish-Irish. I once mentioned to an Irish friend that Yeats was one of my favorite poets, and the response was, oh, he's English. He was English-Irish. Does that hold or not anymore?
It's really a long time ago, and we have to get over it. And I think for me, Yeats, for example, was a Protestant. Now, if that's someone's problem about someone being Irish, well, he was a great Irishman, and he contributed so much to our country, as did Beckett. Joyce was a Catholic. Leopold Bloom was Jewish. Elizabeth Bowen was a woman and a Protestant. In other words, we've got to start putting a lot of hyphens in our identities. We're going to have a time in the future when someone's going to be Syrian and Irish and a woman and gay. In other words, that the project for over the last 30, 40 years in Ireland has been to make clear that you can be Presbyterian and Irish. That idea of saying there's only one way of being Irish, which is to be male and Catholic and straight and Irish, That's over. But also, some of us have received great hospitality in England. I mean, I publish my books in England. I love going to London. They're incredibly decent people to deal with. There has been huge back and forth. I think when the Queen of England came to Ireland and said what she said about that the relations, that while the relations between governments have been very difficult, the relations between families, some of whom, everyone has cousins in England with English accents now because of the emigration, and that every year people go home to each other. And because of the emigration, well, no, not just the EU, but the emigration that's always gone on between the two islands. And I mean, that's in a way why we're so horrified by the referendum that's going on in Britain at the moment over the possibility of them leaving the European Union. Because we joined the same time as they did. And it gave us a sort of freedom. You know, our ministers went as equals with British ministers to Brussels. With them leaving, it will mean that the border between the north and the south will become even more important, and crossing to England will be moving out of the European Union. We're horrified by it. I mean, the only word I can use is horrified, even that they're having one. But the fact that the polls are suggesting that it's 50-50 is frightening for us and horrifying.
I would love to know your theories about why this tiny country of Ireland has produced such extraordinary literature. Do you think it's rooted in the oral tradition? Do you think it's, I mean, Virginia Woolf, I remember in one of her letters or diaries was describing going to a bed and breakfast in Ireland or a hotel and listening to a woman without much education who was so eloquent, and she was just fascinated by the way she used language. Is it rooted in Gaelic? Is it rooted in these beautiful stories that Lady Gregory and Yeats went around collecting so ruthlessly? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of many of those things that has produced a way of using language, even in everyday conversation, that is very charged and it is very layered. And maybe that inevitably drives people towards the page, but then that wouldn't necessarily be the case, would it? I mean, if the everyday way of talking is in itself an art form in a country, why would that necessarily produce writers? I don't really know what the connection is between those two things, but I think that I don't know. I actually don't really know the answer to the question. There are a lot of us, it's true, and there are more and more coming. I mean, Ireland is really at the moment going through a boom in terms of younger writers of Sara's generation. There's so many new novels coming out every year. It's a very healthy climate for writing. I think what I would say in terms of contemporary Ireland is that there are many readers. Events like this, where readers meet with writers, take place several times a week in Ireland. There are many, many festivals, and you get to see in a context like that just how real a hunger there is for literature. And perhaps that's a really encouraging climate to grow up in as a writer, although, you know, lots of us have run away from it at the same time. I don't know. I don't know why. Maybe it's better for writers not to think about the reason why they exist.
No, Belinda, you mentioned earlier, talked about how everyone knows everyone in Ireland, and perhaps because everyone knows a writer, then it seems possible in a way that it perhaps doesn't in other places.
True. Yeah.
But Colm talked as well earlier about how painting and music perhaps don't have the same tradition, because, you know, I kind of disagree. I think the oral tradition becomes the written tradition very easily. Because, you know, you hear something, and if it's compelling enough, you'll put it down on paper. But, you know, because of invasions and our troubled past or whatever things, painting didn't exist, or painting didn't survive in the way that, and it was harder to get physical things. But whereas the oral tradition was something that, you know, we always had. When you think of like hedge schools and penal laws time and all that kind of thing, we could always talk to each other, and I think there's definitely something in that.
I mean, I think that the main thing every mother wanted for her son, and eventually for her daughter, was an indoor job because of the long winter. And there was something associated with outdoor work which people just didn't like the sound of. And you know, they wanted you to get an office job or be a teacher. And literacy. In every family, the idea of you learn to read and write, and it will do everything for you. You can't if you don't have that. And so out of poverty came this sense that there was only one way out of poverty, which was literacy. And I think that's still the case. And the other thing, the strange one, is the proximity to a huge market, a huge hungry market for literature, which I think Indian writers also found, which is southern England. That simply the number of books sold per capita from a line, you draw a line going down towards London, is just so huge. We write in the same language, or most of us do, as they do. And we tell them, we have something to say that they don't know, and they're interested in it. So it provides, oddly enough, the closeness to England and the distance from it gives us something that there's a sense of an audience there. You have to be careful with it, because if you start telling an Irish story that people expect to hear, you start writing cliches. But you can stop yourself doing that easily enough. But the idea that pen and paper are cheap, whereas canvas and as I say, buying a cello in my house would have been impossible. But having a little notebook and a biro was really easy.
I think on that note, we can end. I want to thank our really, truly amazing panelists, Colm, Tóibín, Sara, Baume, Belinda, McKeon.